the Australian aspect of the band, the fact that, you know, they were all down in Australia, that's I think more important than the diversity of the nationalities of everybody in the band. You know, it was escapism from, what they would have seen as a mundane life, you know, doing manual work. And, you know, one, let's escape from that. Two, let's escape from Australia. Three, let's take on the world. So I think the fact that they were all based in Australia, you know, and started in Australia is more important than the fact that half of them are Scottish, and, you know, the bass player comes from Romford, you know, and that.
I feel when you're playing the sort of music acdc played, it was very American in terms of the boogie approach. People are always going to believe it's the American influence that is paramount. But obviously, the fact that they grew up in Australia had to have had an impact, an impression on their attitude towards life, if not towards necessarily music. And I think that certainly shows in the way that they approached the songs, the way they told stories. And it definitely has an Australian impact. And I think to this day, the irony is that they're called an Australian band. Well, not one of them in the band currently, I don't believe. Phil Rudd maybe, but certainly none of the others were born in Australia. They'd moved there, but the young brothers had moved there in the early part of their lives, but they were born in Scotland. Bon Scott was born in Scotland. So in a way, they were more Scottish than they were Australian, but they all really found their niche and their home in Australia. And I think, never having lived in Australia, but understanding a little bit about the culture, I think that open-mindedness of Australians and that sort of enjoyment of life certainly comes through in the way that AC/DC presented their music.
I don't know if the geography, you know, did have that much influence, but if you think about it, you know, growing up in those very early days, you know, in Glasgow or in Scotland, that must have had an effect in the kind of music that they were listening to. And then, you know, going to Australia at such a relatively young age, you know, Australians weren't sort of, they didn't have the same sort of radio system as we did. There wasn't as much, the radio that they had, the pop music radio that they had at that time when they were growing up, was much more restricted. So the chances of hearing sort of, you know, early blues, you know, like we could listen to at that time, say Mike Raven on the BBC Light programme, and hear some, you know, wonderful American blues. I'm not sure that the Australian radio system, both, you know, the national system and the commercial system, whether you got those kind of influences. So I think for them, for the band, a lot of the influences that they brought with them from the old country, that would have formed the sort of foundation of their music.
Look, Australia in the early 60s was, it was virgin ground, and it was hit by, like the whole world, like the Beatles and this whole thing. We'd had Elvis and Bill Haley and all that, and that was still kind of remote, and we had rock and roll stars like Johnny O'Keefe, and the Beatles sort of hit. So it was the same as everywhere. Everything explodes, but the point about that was, well, have you got any idea what you're doing? I mean, there was sort of, when you look at that English scene, the Beatles or whoever, they had roots in, you're able listening to blues records and all that. We didn't have any of that in Australia. Like, blues records weren't released here or that sort of, so you didn't have that input. So a lot of people were just like, you know, rushing at this whole new thing, not really knowing what it was, knowing that they loved it and having to figure out how to do it.